I'm finally getting back to working on the Nissan 2.4 liter engine after a few weeks, and I received the Hastings piston rings, the extra ones that I was missing. Originally, I had ordered what I thought was a full set, but once I received it in the details, it said it was for one piston, so I had to order 3 more through Summit Racing, and it took probably a little over 3 weeks to get. But I finally received those, so the pistons will be ready to go back together. And got my pile of books. I will put another picture in this video. There's 4 different ones. There's a Climber, Haynes, Nissan Service Manual, and the awesome one is How to Keep Your Datsun Nissan L and Z Series Nissan Alive. So previously I painted the block. It's looking really good. I got all the freeze plugs put in it. I drove in the oil galley plugs here. There's one on either end because the oil galley goes all the way through. So next up is fitting all of the main bearings into the block, and I will be using plastic gauge to check clearances. I ordered the same size bearings as were previously in the engine because I'm not changing the crank, and at this point I could get the crank reground if I need to, but I'm hoping that I won't need to do that. The bearings were not terribly expensive, so if I do find out that has to happen, getting the appropriately sized bearings won't be too big of a deal. Next up is taking the crank. I'm going to go ahead and, while I have it out, drive out the clutch pilot bushing and put the new one in there, and then also really spend some time looking over the crank journals with a magnifying glass to make really sure they look okay. And you're probably hearing Penny over here just chirping away, wondering what the heck I'm doing out in the shop. Unfortunately, every once in a while she gets trapped out here because she hides out and then gets stuck in here for a day, and I hear a cat yowling. So on the end of the crank, on pretty much any engine that has a clutch, you have a pilot bushing. And that's this right here. And the snout of the input shaft that goes in the transmission rides onto this bushing, and there's supposed to be some lubrication in there, and then the clutch rides about in this area, and then on the input shaft in the transmission you also have bearings, so it's kind of supported at both ends with the clutch riding in the middle. This pilot bushing eventually gets worn out, and they're so cheap that every time you ever have the flywheel or the should say the clutch off, it's best to just replace it. The trick is getting it out of there. You can use a hacksaw by hand and cut through the sleeve until you can pull it out. There are some pullers for it. What I'm going to do, because I have a pretty well-equipped machine shop, is I'm going to find either a bolt or just a piece of bar stock, turn it down so it's just a slight slip fit in there, and then what you do is put a couple of good shots of grease inside of it, and then you just hit it with a hammer, and literally the hydraulic force will just shoot that sleeve right out of there. So I'll go ahead and get prepped for that. So I have my caliper. I tend to buy these cheap ones just because they get damaged in the shop. Mitutoyo and Starrett make really nice ones, but these ones are so cheap and they're accurate enough for my uses that if it gets damaged I can just throw it away. So what I'm going to do is come in here and measure. It's like 0.665 of an inch, so just a little bit over half of an inch. So 0.665. So what I need to do is turn a piece of bar stock or find a bolt, though I don't really have any that big, that will act as a piston. So unfortunately I was running this in slow motion with no audio for some reason, so I sped it back up. Here it shows me filling the hole in the end of the crank with grease, and then this is a piece that I turned on my metal lathe for a slip fit in the bushing, and then shortly you'll see me grab a hammer and hit the end of it. The intent is that driving that in will literally pressurize the grease around that punch and then force the bushing out. That didn't work, I think, because the bushing was so thin. So what I'm showing here is how I used a little hand hacksaw with the blade put in with the teeth pointing forward so it cuts on the push stroke instead of the pull stroke, so I can control it better. gently sawed through the bushing in 2 places. And I'm showing them here how thin they are. The new one is much thicker. And then I used this punch that was broken. It was an old pin punch, and I ground the end of it to be kind of a beveled, sharp blade. And then with a hammer, I was able to tap that underneath the remnants of the bushing and pry them out of there fairly easily. And now I'm looking at the crank, the rear flange on the crank. Somebody had beat on it. I wasn't sure at the time. In hindsight, I think somebody used a pry bar to take off the rear main bearing cap, but I'm going over that, and I used a fine file to gently go over that area in kind of a circular motion, following the curvature until the file wasn't biting anymore. And then with a bare hand and a towel, a paper towel, I went over that gently to see if there's any burrs or anything, and it feels really good. Nothing actually rides on that particular spot, but when I put the rear main seal on, I don't want it to snag on that and cause any problems. And here I'm talking about the oil passages in the crank. It comes off of the main bearing and then feeds 2 of the connecting rods. And there's a plug at the end of the connecting rod journal that you could remove to clean it out. So pretty much wrapping up cleaning the crank. I've gone over all of the different parts. Wire really is not going to clean down there, so what I did is, you probably saw it on the video, the time lapse, was I just ran a whole bunch of brake cleaner down through there, blew it out, rinse and repeat until everything looked like it came out clean. Honestly, I think it's going to be good enough, but that's also kind of the limits of what I can do. And like I said, you can drill out these oil galleys if you were really going crazy. I'm just not willing to do that. This is not a race engine, and it's also not a truck that I'm trying to get 100 or a million miles out of. Clean is good enough. So I also cleaned all the grease and gunk out of where the pilot bushing goes. I think the manual says that needs to be driven in 4 millimeters, I think. So I will check that with an a caliper. I blew out all these holes, and then this here, I basically just went over that lightly with a file until I couldn't feel anything. It wasn't catching anymore, and nothing actually rides on there. The main seal rides back a little further, and one of the things the book talks about, there is a slight groove there. When I put the main seal on, I'm going to measure the clearance in there, and then I'm going to drive it on probably like 1/8 of an inch less, so it'll be out about 1/8 of an inch, just so that it rides on good clean surface. Yeah, it's pretty hard to show you, but I can see it, and I can actually feel a groove worn in there as well. So if I just shift that slightly and make sure it's perpendicular to the crank, but just shift that out ever so slightly, it will work just fine. But then it'll also ride on a clean unscored part of the crank. So other than that, I went over all the journals with bare hand and a paper towel to see if anything caught. Everything looks really good. They're really minor scratchings, what I would call service scratchings, just from being in service and running oil through it, but nothing that looks like it's going to tear up any of the new bearings. So at this point, I feel pretty good about it. I also use these blue towels. I call them Clark towels because that's one of the brand names. But by using these technically, if there's any lint left in here, should just break down and be flushed out of the engine. Whereas if you use like red shop rags, actual fabric ones, that doesn't do that. That will actually continue to float around in there. Probably wouldn't cause any issues, but if you used a bunch and just left a whole bunch of lint in there, that's not going to be good. That can potentially plug up your filter if you're not paying attention, or just cause other issues. So if you read any of the manuals that talk about honing and boring cylinders, they always talk about when you're cleaning it, when you do the final clean, you use like a paper towel for that reason. One, you can see on a white towel if there's any junk left in there, but two, any lint just gets flushed away with the oil and won't cause any problem. So at this point, I need to take the nut and washer off the front of the crank and check out the bearing inserts. The manual talks about A and B grade inserts for different parts of the engine, and honestly, this has different bearings in it. I mean, they're all, I think they're 0.75 millimeter oversize. So I assume that means the crank was turned at some point. So I don't think I need to worry about that real special bearing clearances. I've never heard of that. Usually the whole engine, the crank would be turned to the same size on, the connecting rod journals and in the main journals, and a standard set of bearings would fit and you'd just be good. So it's kind of interesting that's called out in a couple of different places. So I'll do a little more research on that, but I'm not too worried about, the bearing issues. I'm going to check the clearances, like I said, and once I have the main bearings oiled, once I check the clearances and then oil the main bearings and put it in and torque it down, hopefully for the final time, I'll spin it. And if I should be able to just spin it by hand, and it should just spin like it's on glass. There shouldn't be any play, but there should be very little drag other than from the rear main seal. And then the front main seal goes on when you put the front cover on. So it's kind of where we're at. I'm using a trouble light kind of as scene lighting to help so you guys can see what I'm doing. I'm just not really set up with, studio lighting out in the shop. So apologize for some of the stuff that may be a little hard to see. So this is the thrust bearing, and you'll notice that it has tangs a tang on one side, the oil hole. This goes right here. And what this does is this counteracts the push. Sorry, this is the front of the block, this is the back. Clutch is mounted on here. Every time you push in the clutch pedal, you're pushing on a large diaphragm pressure plate, and the opposing force, it's trying to push the crank forward. The opposing force is taken up by this. There's a machine surface on the crank, and what it does is this gets oil. This is all oiled up really well when the engine's running. The crank will actually push against this, and this particular surface is what keeps the crank from shifting and essentially locating the crank. Okay, figured out a couple of things. So the box came instructions, and I don't know why exactly, but this particular bearing that goes in number 1 slot, it's got a little hole in it. There's a main oil feed hole, but it's got this little one, and I don't know why. Anyway, on the back of each one, right in here, they're stamped. According to instructions, these are all marked. These are marked -1128, and there's M1, M2, M3, M2, and then M4 in that order. And a difference I noticed is the original bearings that were in this, both upper and lower halves had a groove in it. In this particular case, these are Mall slash Cleveite. Mall must have bought it Cleveite. Only the ones in the block with the oil holes have the grooves, so the ones that go in the caps don't. I'm going to double check that, but it sounds like that's how it's supposed to be, so that should be fine. The other thing I discovered is, unfortunately, I don't think I ordered a set of connecting rod bearings. I think, again, my assumption, I thought this whole bearing kit was like the entire engine. Well, I think it's just the crank, or the main bearings. And so I got all the main bearing caps cleaned. If you can see this, they all have an arrow, kind of a crude arrow cast into them. This one says F for front, and it is indeed the one that goes on the front of the engine. There's a different one that goes in the middle, and then there's a completely different one that goes in the back that has room for the seal, the rear main seal, and then there's the 2 intermediate ones. So now I'm going to put the bearings in here and get the plastic gauge, and we'll get set up for some clearance checking. So I have the caps on. They are lightly snugged down, just using a speed handle. And now I'm setting up a torque wrench, half-inch drive, and I believe we're supposed to go to 65 foot-pounds. I will confirm that. I'm going to start off at 20, and this is just kind of a classic older Craftsman beam type or click type torque wrench. Nothing fancy, but it works perfectly adequate for what I'm doing. So I'm going to run everything down 20 and then go 40, and then I'll end up at the 60 or 65. Like I said, I need to confirm that, but I'll do that before I get to the final torque. So I had intended to torque that in 3 different steps, but when I checked the manual for the NAP-Z engines from 1981 on, they're actually 36 foot-pounds. So technically I'm about 4 foot-pounds over. The manual does not talk about oiling the bolts. One of the manuals, but another one does say that you need to oil the bolts and then underneath the heads just to help with friction. Usually if it's don't specify oiled or not, if you oil it, you actually have to reduce the applied torque because technically there's less friction. But like I said, one of the manuals actually says, you know, lightly oil the threads and under the head, and then 36 foot-pounds. So we're good. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and gently, well, I'll take all the bolts back out, but then gently pry the caps off, hopefully not disturbing the plastic gauge. You'll notice that I went and actually put a dab of grease on there. Some of the things that you read say it has to be completely oil-free, but actually on Plastic Gauge's website, they recommend putting a little dab of grease. And what I found is when I put the first one down on the rear main, the rear main journal, I don't know if you noticed, but the plastic gauge actually fell off. It's not sticky. It's like a hard wax. It's not a soft wax, and it's not sticky at all. So I just went and got a dab of grease and put it on the rest of the journals, and then that just held the plastic gauge on there. So it'll be interesting to see if it sticks on the crank or if it comes off on the bearings. So. They call these speed handles, and basically it's like a brace and bit, but it's for sockets. This is a half-inch drive. I have some 3/8. These are actually old school Craftsman, and I don't know if they have bearings or just regular bushings in here, but these are older and they still are really smooth. At the swap meet down in Salem at the Antique Tractor Show that I go to every summer, a guy had a bunch of them and was hardly asking anything for them, so I just grabbed them all, and I figured I'll put some on the wall just for decorations, but really great tool. So I got all the bolts out, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the first cap, and we will see what we have. First bearing here measured at right at 2/1000ths with a plastic gauge, and the specs in the manual are 8/10,000ths to 24/1000ths of an inch. So 0.0024 is considered the standard maximum, and this measures at 0.002. The actual limit, according to the service manual, is 0.0047 or 47/1000ths, which would be almost twice as loose as it is. So our bearing clearances are looking really good so far. So I'll go ahead and pull the rest of the caps off and check them, and hopefully we'll be looking good. So I pulled all the caps, and this one, the rear main, thought it was undersized, but it actually measured out okay. Unfortunately, I shifted the crank slightly and it smeared it a bit, but kind of messed it up here. But over here, it measured right at 2 thousandths. So everything was 2 thousandths or just a tiny bit over. I think I might have figured out why the end of the crank was chewed up. This engine's been into before, and I wonder if somebody just used a pry bar, reached in on and just reefed on that the end of the crank, trying to get the main cap off for some reason and chewed it up. I used a rolled up towel and was very gentle with how I pried it up, not to cause any problems. Same with the middle. So yeah, we're looking really good. So I can pull the caps off, clean off the plastic gauge, make it really clean, and then go ahead and oil the mains and then bolt this puppy back together. And then we will have the bottom end together, and we still have to do the connecting rods. So I have put the rear main seal on, and what I did was use my caliper, and on the ends of most of these calipers there is a extension that sticks out. So what I did was noticed where the groove was on the crank, spaced the seal out just a touch, tried to square it up as best I could by hand, and then I took this against the base, against the edge of the crank, and just ran it in gently until I touched the seal, and then just went all the way around and got it lined up so that it's running dead concentric all the way around. I think that was off a tiny bit, or I bumped it. So that's outside of the previous groove by, it's a little less than 1/8 of an inch. This will get a little bit of sealer around it that'll hold it, so when that dries it won't shift at all. And then this is the centered bronze bearing, the pilot bushing that goes in the end of the crank. This was formerly the piece I was trying to use to drive the old bushing off. So I turned it down a little bit so it fits this newer one. And that's what's interesting, is the newer one's a little thicker. So before I drive that in, I'm going to test fit that on the end of the transmission and make sure that that's the right part. But with this, I turned this down to fit and then put a square shoulder on it, and just a loose fit, and now I can just drive that in. And then the manual says from the surface here to the edge of the bushing is supposed to be 4 millimeters, so it needs to be countersunk 4 millimeters. I had one of these pickups back in the early 90s. It was a 720. It was identical, but it was two-wheel drive, but it was the same model and everything other than just being two-wheel drive. I changed the clutch in it, and I noticed after I did that, this was back in the mid-90s, it was really hard to get it into gear. And I'm thinking what happens is when I replaced that bushing, I didn't have the measurements, and I may have actually had it out a little bit, so it's probably been pushing on the end of the input shaft whenever you push the clutch in. So it was kind of pushing the input shaft or spinning the input shaft and wasn't letting it completely disengage. But that's 25 plus years ago at this point, so nothing I can do about it now. So I went over and checked the input shaft on the transmission. This fits on there, has just a tiny bit of play, but that's to be expected. So what we'll do is take this, I'm going to drive it in just a little bit. So it's down or countersunk just a tiny bit, and I will change this to millimeters, and I will go off the end of this and check. And I am, it's like 1.8, so a little bit more to go. And I'll just sneak up on it because to pull that out would possibly destroy it. So it actually feels like that thing's seated. So that's really not going in any further. I'm at 3.8, so that may be, I'll get a light and check in there, but that may be as far as it'll go. For that, I'm using this, the Right Stuff Permatex. It's better than like your run-of-the-mill silicone sealer or blue goo. It's actually kind of rubbery when it dries, so it works really good. One of my mechanic friends really recommended it. So the Nissan manuals, it's buried at the bottom, so I'm not going to pull it out. The cap that goes in here, the Nissan manual talks about putting a strip of sealant in these grooves and then also up the side. So I'm going to go ahead and put the sealant on the seal, drop the crank in, make sure that fits right, and then go ahead and apply the sealant on the cap when I set it on there, and then should be ready to make some progress. Okay, that was pretty fiddly. Once I put the assembly lube on the inside of the seal that you're supposed to do before putting it on the crank, it's like super slippery, so you breathe on it and the seal moves. So I had to reposition it a couple of times. So it's got sealant on it, and I set the crank down in there, and now I'm going to do my best to check it. Problem is, with it on this engine stand, it's kind of hard to do. So what I'll just do is feel around. Yeah, it feels dead square with the back surface of the block too. That feels really good. It's just flush like it needs to be. So yeah, I think we're good with that. I'll go ahead and put a touch of oil on each one of these. We already put some on there, but I'm just going to touch more to make sure. And I also purchased Vivor, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of like a Chinese, I don't know, vendor, like I think another one's Temu that's out there. Vivor tends to have stuff more for like shop use and that kind of thing. And they had a pressure, well, they actually say it's for powder coating. I don't know what you would use it for, but basically it's a pressurized vessel that you can take the lid off of. So I bought one, and what I'm going to do is put a gallon container inside and then put motor oil in it and then pressurize it to about 50 psi, and then when I'm ready to prime the engine, I'll screw that in where the oil sender would go, and I can open that up, and then with like the valve cover off the top, I can see oil going everywhere coming out of the camshaft and everything, and I know it's completely oiled before I even turn the engine over. Sometimes you can do that with an oil pump on some engines if you modify a distributor. This engine is a little different with how the oil pump fits on there. It's actually part of the distributor drive like other engines, but it's a real pain to get installed and have it timed correctly. So I really was just hoping to avoid all of that. So now what I need to do is a little prep work and get a couple of seals and get ready to put the rear main cap on, which is going to be a little interesting because you're supposed to put oil in, or not oil, but sealant on certain places, and there's square seals that get driven into these, and there's actually little nails that then you drive in after that compress that seal and make it so it seals even better. It's just kind of an oddity that Nissan did for some reason, but it seems to work. Okay, so I got these parts out, the seal parts. This is a Felpro gasket kit, so it's a little different. Instead of using nails, these are the actual seals that go in the rear bearing cap, and instead of nails, it actually has these flat pieces, and they're beveled. And what you do is you want the beveled part to go against the seal so that when you drive it in there, it doesn't tear into the seal. The outside. Can't really see down in here, unfortunately, but so this goes this way. This is where that seal rides on this piece here, and then this is on the inside of the engine. And just a touch of oil on there. Don't have to go crazy with it. What I need to do is line this up and try to get it in straight so that it doesn't upset the rear seal. And you guys can't really see it, but on the back side, that seal is just dead perfect. It's nice and even with the outside of the block. The actual factory service manual says the main bearing caps are supposed to be 33 to 40 foot-pounds. I sighted on the high side, so I did it 15, 30, and then finished at 40, and went through all of them. So it's looking good. The crank still rotates really nice, so we're looking really good. So next up is putting in these little seals. So like I said, I don't know if you can see it, but the back side's flat, and then this other side has a groove on it. The grooves on the cap are actually cut into the cap, not the block. So I'm thinking that the groove on this with the little seal should go facing the block, and then the nail or the metal piece will drive in behind it, which will flare those out and make them good and tight. So these are different than what the factory had. The factory ones were square and had almost like a real fine vertical kind of accordion, I don't know what you want to call it, grooves in it, and then there literally was a small wire nail. This is Felpro setup. It's a little different. Is what it is. So, yeah, no matter what, it should be fine. Get them in that groove. It's just going to be really messy. I don't want any of it coming loose and floating around inside the engine, and this won't. So, doing that. And then these are actually longer. They're oversized, and then you're supposed to trim them once you're done. I'm going to come in behind, and the bevel will go towards the seal so that it doesn't cut into the seal. I'm just going to and I will use a little clean. I'll come in on this, and then this actually drives flush with the cap, but the seal stays proud, and then what you're supposed to do is go back in and then cut the seal with a razor blade and leave it like, I think, a 1/16 of an inch proud. That way when you put the oil pan on, that seal will flex just a little bit and you have a nice tight seal. I'm going to drive that metal just a touch, so it's below the surface now. So our crank is in, and it should not be coming back out again. So if I grab one of the counterweights, I can move this really nice. It feels really good. Don't have any problem spinning it around. I did check the end clearance off camera, looks perfect. Literally, it matches exactly what the factory says it's supposed to be. And that's controlled by the bearing that's in here, that not clamshell bearing, but anyway, the bearing shell. That rides on both sides of the journal and keeps this crank centered. When you push on the clutch pedal and it tries to shove the crank forward, all that's transmitted to this bearing here. So you can kind of see a little bit of tint from the sealant around there, but there's not a bunch of sealant squeezing out, and then there is grease inside of the seal. Once the engine starts running, it'll get oil on it and it'll be fine. So yeah, so it feels like I actually made some progress today. Again, with one of these projects, slowing down and double checking it, as you go through these steps is what's going to actually let this engine live a long time. And if something does not match up, stop and check it. Sometimes you just want to get projects done, but this is what makes or breaks an engine, the fundamentals like this. So after this, yeah, it's going to be cleaning pistons and checking the rings and all of that kind of stuff, flipping the block over, checking all the rings, making sure they're good. What we're looking for is to make sure that the end gap on the rings don't close up or touch. I think there's supposed to be like 1 millimeter gap. Again, I'll check that against the manual. And I have some tools that I'll show you later that will center the ring, and then you can check it with a feeler gauge, and you just go through all 4 sets of rings, and that's, again, attention to detail. This is Penny. She's one of our cats that likes to come in the shop, and if I don't pay attention, she'll actually get trapped inside overnight, which she really doesn't like. Hi, Penny. Yep, she's talkative.